Well, Bill, should we get started?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Let's go.
Okay, so welcome everybody. It's a beautiful day here. I'm in Minneapolis and Bill's in Bloomington, but I think it's beautiful all in the metro area. And I know we have people joining us from all over the system campuses, and I hope you have a beautiful day there too. This is a seminar on strategies for asynchronous discussion forums. We're tending to see a lot of use of that now because of our current situation. My colleague is Bill Rosaitis, and he and I both work at the Center for Educational Innovation. And my name is Paul Bepler, and want to welcome you to this session. And we thought we'd start by taking a look at this graphic, which gives us a sense of how communication can be thought of in terms of both bandwidth and its immediacy level. We think of immediacy when we think of presence, whether it's student presence or teaching presence. So it's a good way to think about where we would situate discussion forums or asynchronous learning. So if you look in the upper right quadrant, the red quadrant, that's where you would see high immediacy and high bandwidth tools and modalities. And that's what Zoom would be, right? So we can see each other. If we turn on our cameras, we can hear each other. And it's happening in real time, but it takes a lot of bandwidth. And my own internet has kind of flummoxed around a little bit today. I'm hoping it'll stay in here, but that's one of the issues, right? I was speaking to a colleague of mine from MCTC just this morning. I ran into her on a walk, and she was suggesting that among her population, they lost, or she was just finished in grades, and they lost about 25% of their students after the COVID switchover happened. And a lot of that had to do with poor internet access. So we're really concentrating on the low bandwidth, low immediacy level. So when we're talking about discussions, we're in the green quadrant down here. And it's sort of a sweet spot where we have a better chance of reaching all of our students. And we also can have a sense that they can do things in a time frame that is limited, but there's more variation in there, so that if they're taking care of children or parents or someone who's not feeling well or have multiple jobs that they're balancing, whatever it is, there's just a better chance that they'll be able to participate and complete your course if we have at least some of our opportunities geared toward this sort of green quadrant, where the bandwidth is easier for them to manage and afford, and the immediacy, which is maybe the trade-off, is perhaps a little bit less. With this in mind, we want to sort of start thinking about different ways that we can really make the best use of that old workhorse, the discussion forum. We've had it available to us, and we probably used it in very traditional ways. And Bill's going to start us off by talking about a few different structures for creating engaging discussions.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks, Paul. So as Paul mentioned, we were thinking about discussion boards in terms of their immediacy, and where they may have less immediacy than, let's say, a synchronous webinar that like we're having now. You can still build in different opportunities for students to interact. And in fact, we think that's a best practice, but it also involves some risk. And as I about different formats, and I'll also give you some tips to consider as you're designing your discussion boards, so that you can try to get the best results that you possibly can. So the discussion boards can be very useful for meeting many of the cognitive goals that you have in your course. They can help develop higher order skills, and they can also encourage community building and interaction among your students, and that's where the immediacy comes in. But the strategies that you use in a face-to-face course are not necessarily going to work in an online discussion forum. For one thing, the timing is completely different. I tend to think of, I've been teaching online courses for many years, and I tend to think of my discussions in terms of weeks. So is this going to be a 1-week discussion, or is it going to be a 2-week discussion? And depending on what you want students to do, you might carve out the time in terms of a sequence of tasks that they will complete over that week or those 2 weeks. Whereas if you were in a face-to-face class, you may be able to achieve that in a half an hour, right? Or maybe a full class session. The kinds of prompts you use in a face-to-face class will also be very different than in an online class. You have to be much more specific in terms of your guiding questions. And in particular, you have to be much more specific in terms of what you're asking students to do. In other words, how long should the post be? What should you respond to? How should you interact with others? Those kinds of things. Where in a face-to-face class discussion, we already know what those norms are. So there are differences like that that you need to keep in mind. So with using that as kind of some framing ideas, let's go through some examples of different kinds of formats that you could use. So the first one that you see here, we call a post and respond forum. And this is probably the most common kind of discussion forum that you'll see. You may have assigned this before, or you may have participated in it. In a forum, in a post and respond forum, a teacher launches the forum usually. Sometimes it could be a student question, and then individuals reply to that particular question. And you see the arrows here signify that often students are asked to respond to each other too. So there can be an interaction between the faculty and the student, and then between students and students. When I talk to people, instructors, about online discussions and their successes or failures, this is a format that's often mentioned in a very negative way because people say things like, oh, I've asked students to post a response and then I asked them to respond to 2 other students. And while their response to the initial post, my question, is usually good, their subsequent responses to students are very shallow, they're superficial. And so this doesn't work. And that is a problem. It's not necessarily the fault of the discussion format. I think it's more an issue with the prompt. If you tell students to respond to other people, they're not going to know what to do. So you need to build into the prompt how you want them to respond. And in fact, into the initial question, you may be thinking about how that's setting up the interaction that students are going to be doing later. So for example, you may be asking them a question about the course, but then you also might be saying, come up with a way that it relates to larger issues in our particular course, or come up with an idea for how it might be applied in a real setting, or with a problem that you've found, something like that. Or maybe you ask students to pose a question at the end of their particular, their initial response. All of those things are hooks that you can then direct other students to respond to. So in a sense, what you're doing is you're giving them more direction for how to actually engage with each other. And when you do those types of things, you tend to get much better responses and better interaction among your students. So again, this is a workhorse, like Paul said. You see it quite frequently, but you really have to pay attention to the prompts and also the pacing. The other thing that people will do that I think is a problem is they'll say, respond to answer this question and respond to 2 other students by Friday. So of course, what happens, you can all guess, Thursday night, all the other posts come in, right? I mean, they wait till the deadline in order to post. So you're not going to get much very rich back and forth among students because the timing didn't work out. So in this case, besides having the prompt and a good hook there for students to reply to, it might be reply to the initial question by Monday, reply to 1 other student's concern or comment by Wednesday, and then a second by Friday. So you're breaking it up, right? And then when students revisit the discussion board over the course of that week, they can see these discussions building out, and you tend to get a richer experience. So again, it's these little tips that can help make these more effective in the online environment. Another format that's useful and that I've used and others have had good luck with as well is called the quote analysis assignment. And this is not dissimilar from the post and response, but it's got a twist, and that is the students are the ones who are generating the content that the rest of the class responds to. So this is particularly useful for courses that are heavily focused on readings. We learned about this from a philosophy professor at one of the Minnesota State institutions, and it's perfect for a course like that where students are reading complicated texts very closely and responding to those particular texts. In this case, what students will do is they're assigned a reading, and the first 4 students pick a quote from the reading that that either is interesting to them or confusing, or that exemplifies larger themes in the course, or that they disagree with. However you want to shape it, they cite that quotation, and then they explicate it somehow. They analyze it. And at the end of that analysis, oftentimes they'll post a question for other students, or perhaps it's a challenge for them to address some aspect of it. But then after the first 4 posters go, the rest of the students choose to respond to one of those 4 threads. So in a sense, what you're having students do is sort of define or delimit the boundaries of the conversation by the quotations that they pick. And I've used this in my courses, teaching graduate students, and they loved this. They really thought this was one of the most interesting discussion formats, because they were able to go in, they were able to read something critically, analyze it, and then have conversations with their peers around things that they felt were particularly interesting. The other thing about this, and I think this raises an important general point, and this is worth considering, is that it breaks up the course, the entire number, the course, the class number, into 4 sort of groups, so that typically the number of posts per thread, if you think of each one of these being a thread, has fewer posts to it. And that's something else to consider too. If you have a course with 40 students in it, or 50, even if it's 25, and you're asking students to make an initial post and then do some reposting to others, you can get to 60, 70, 80 plus posts very quickly. And that becomes overwhelming for students. So we recommend trying to figure out ways to break the class into smaller groups, so the amount of posting is a little bit more manageable. You can do that by just randomly selecting half of the class to respond to one, that maybe they're responding to the same question but in 2 different threads. Or maybe they're different questions that they're responding to, which will then be summarized and shared out at the end of this discussion. But it's worthwhile thinking about how you can try to manage the volume of posts, particularly from the student's point of view, because that's another factor in the degree to which they can dig into these discussion boards. Another format that can work really well in an online discussion forum is peer review. So for those of you who have students develop things like presentations or written reports or essays or something like that, you can actually have students work with each other in groups of 2 or perhaps 3 or maybe even 4 to critique each other's work. This can work in discussion forums in Canvas. You could create groups for your students, and they could attach files and carry on peer review conversations in Canvas. There's also a tool in Canvas to support peer review. The way that I've done it, I find to be a little more manageable, is actually just using Google Drive. So I'll create groups in Drive with students and have them upload their material and do their peer reviews in Drive. But it's not essentially different than doing the same sort of thing in Canvas. One thing I'll mention about peer review that I've found over the years is, just like the discussion prompts, you have to be extremely specific about what it is that you want students to look at. So I usually come up with a sheet that says these are the things, and go through each of these and make comments on your peers' work, both written comments, and then if you have a synchronous component, they might be able to have a discussion about it. But again, you need to spell out what students should be looking at. Otherwise, you risk getting superficial comments from your students. Things like, oh, that's a great idea, or this flows well, or something like that, which doesn't really tell the writer much about how the revision should occur. And then finally, we can talk a little bit about group posts. Paul's going to have an example in a minute where he talks about a Jigsaw, which is a kind of group posting. These are more complicated to use in an online environment than the other formats that we've mentioned up to this point, and it's because collaborative work in an online environment is more difficult. It's not to say that it can't be done, but it just takes more planning on your part as the instructor, and a little bit more support of your students too. So some of the things, but group work does work, I think it can be really useful in an online course because it does increase that immediacy that we mentioned earlier, that sense of presence. Online experiences can be very isolating for students, and even if they're responding to other people, it still feels like you're talking to a computer screen rather than a flesh and blood human being. So if you can create opportunities where students can do meaningful collaboration, so much the better. It helps personalize the online experience and creates that sense of presence. So their group projects are really good for things like critiquing articles or case studies. People often use them for case studies. Maybe those case studies result in some kinds of recommendations. Maybe it's researching and presenting information. Like this we have here, group research issues. You could have students research different topics and present them to the class, or maybe they're going to summarize or annotate research articles or something like that. So these can be done, I think, relatively easily. Again, by grouping in Canvas or just by creating different forum discussion threads for different groups. Some things to keep in mind with groups, and I've learned some of this the hard way. Make sure that students are producing something that's meaningful and authentic to them. Maybe it's generating materials that will be useful to the rest of the class, like a summary or something like that. Or maybe they're giving advice on how the ideas or recommendations can be applied to another context. Ideally, it should be something that they find is worth doing. And the task should be complex enough to require a group. So in other words, if it's just a task that can be completed by 1 or 2 people, but you've got 4 people doing it, that's a good way to ensure that some of your students might check out. So that might mean that you choose roles for groups, right? In other words, we all bring a particular role to this, and it's going to be important for completing this particular project. And I would highly recommend that in online courses you consider roles, because students need more of a scaffold for group work in this environment. These could be things like the note taker, the person who finds resources, the writer or editor, the person who takes ideas and forms them into the final shape that's then delivered to the professor or other students in the class. And key for online, I've learned, is to have somebody be the project manager. You can call it whatever you want, but the idea is that this individual is the person who creates the Google folder, if you're going to be using that, and creates shared documents. Make sure that everybody has them. Make sure that meetings are set up and that's communicated to students. Make sure that everybody's email is shared with the rest of the members of the group. Those kinds of things. The person who communicates with the faculty member about the group project progress, right? And make sure that the group is meeting its milestones or its deadlines. Without that, you end up, it just becomes a really messy process, and groups sort of really struggle. So I found that to be useful. And just be prepared that if you are doing collaborative work in an online environment, that you are going to have to be more present to your students than you might have been if you were doing it in class. That is, you'll at least have to communicate with the project manager. And maybe that you'll want to have periodic meetings with the full group as well. So it's just considering those types of things as you go through, but they can be effective activities. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and he can talk about another group strategy called the Jigsaw.
Thanks, Bill. So this is another one of those more complex ways of getting students to interact, and it has a sort of interesting historical moment. It was developed by a psychologist in 1971, Elliot Aronson, to react to, and along with some graduate students, to react to a moment in the cities in terms of desegregation. They were having problems with students not being able to prepare uh, equitably, to perform well in class. And so they came up with this strategy which works in every situation. You can see by this slide that there are a couple rounds, and actually I would add a third round here, which is the initial round. And the best way to think about it perhaps is to think about it, take an example and walk through it. So let's imagine that you had a set of essays that you wanted students to read, or readings that you wanted students to read. Let's imagine this class has 16 students in it, but any kind of multiple will work. Let's then therefore imagine that you have maybe 4 essays that you want the entire class to be prepared to discuss. So what you would do is you divide the class into equitable groups, usually somewhere between, I would say 3 and 6 or so is a good size. In this case, we have 4 of each group. We have the A, B, C, and D group, and we give them each a different essay. So group A has essay 1, group B has essay 2, et cetera, et cetera. The first round, everybody reads it, they gloss it, they try to think about, what is critical here, what might be a problem with whatever the reading is. You may give them very specific questions to help interrogate the topic that you're trying to address. Then in round 2, they would gather into a discussion forum, or you could also manage this in a Google Doc, and you might actually want to use both. And you would have them take apart and say, well, what would the talking points for this article be? If I were going to teach someone else the content that is in our article, what would I want to bring out? And then you have them list that, in subsequent discussion posts, and then come up with a ranking of what's important or what really needs to be delivered to people who want to or need to learn this material. And then maybe you would have them consolidate all of that into a Google Doc so they have a cheat sheet or some kind of document from which they could speak. And so now you've got these experts. You've developed 4 different areas of expertise, all the A's, B's, C's, and D's. They're experts in 4 different articles. That's when you sort of reshuffle the groups. And now you make them much more heterogeneous. And so you've got one expert in essay 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you put them all together into those 4 new groups. And this is where you would it would be wonderful if you could sort of now blend the modalities so that you would do this last part potentially in a Zoom setting. You could do it asynchronously, but it would be more efficient if you did it in a setting such as this. And you'd put people into breakout rooms, and you'd say, okay, now I want all the A's to teach essay 1. You've got 7 minutes to teach your essay. You've got your cheat sheet in front of you. Now, help your colleagues understand what was critical about essay number 1. And then when that moment is over, you give them a moment to take a breath, and you move on to essay 2, 3, and 4. You might have 5 or 6 essays, depending on how big your class is and how much material is called for. And then at the end of that, you can then reconvene the group and have a whole class discussion. And you can do that again in Zoom if you've got that opportunity, or else you could have one of the rules that an additional person, if you made the groups be of 5, could be that they would have to summarize what the takeaways were. And you could have then the cheat sheet and the summary as 2 different artifacts from those discussions, and those are also useful for students down the road. It's also helpful for accessibility as well. But the idea is you start independently, you move to a situation, a group situation where they are teaching each other about the one article, and then secondarily, or in the third round, they teach each other about a new article. That way, everybody has an equal opportunity to prepare, and then to teach each other so that everybody has an equal opportunity to learn the material and show that they know the material. So it creates a good class atmosphere as well and reduces the cognitive load for all that material that they would have otherwise had to read so closely. So it does take some planning, as you can imagine, and you need those moments where you can check in on them. So you could look at their cheat sheet, you could look at their summary, you could have a whole class discussion to make sure that they're on point and that they are getting what you wanted them to get from the experience in the first place. With that, I think we're moving on to moderating strategies, and Bill's going to be talking about that.
Yeah. So, so we talked about constructing the format for the discussions, and now we're going to talk a little bit about what you actually do to guide those discussions. It's facilitation is, like I said earlier, different than what you do in class. Although there are some similarities, in an online environment, your goal as the professor is really to act as a facilitator and to encourage engagement and interaction among your students, both with the content, with you, and with each other. So you think about those three kinds of interactions. One way of doing this is through various kinds of moderating behaviors that basically cue students into how they should interact in this particular space. So a couple things to consider. How are you giving feedback to students? I think it's good to try to work in variety of feedback, both to individuals, that is, you're going to give students feedback on their written work probably. You may post in the discussion boards, but you don't have to post to everybody, just to signal your presence. But you also might give broadcast feedback to the whole class through a Canvas announcement or through email. So for example, in a typical, let's say you have a typical discussion forum, you might go in there, let's say daily, and spend a little bit of time reading through and commenting on students' work. It's not really assessing them, but it's doing things like, that's a great idea, here's a resource, or it made me think about this. How does this relate to the other thing that we've talked about? Can anybody in the class add to that? Or I like what Jennifer said. It sounds similar to Scott's idea. Does anybody have a way of reconciling those two, or taking those two in a new direction? So it's those kinds of cues where you're shaping the conversation and directing it. Don't feel like you have to comment on every single person's post. It's just too much, and it actually I think can be a little counterproductive, because that signals that the conversation is one way between you and the students, and what you want to do is encourage people to be cross-talking with each other, which is where those kinds of interaction cues and those moves come in. So a few posts in the discussion forum, and then maybe a weekly summary. Some people do it on Monday to say this is what's coming up in the week and this is what we talked about last week. Or maybe it happens on Friday where you send out a broadcast email and say, these are the 2 or 3 major threads that I noticed in this particular week. I think it's also important to call individuals out by name. The more you can use people's names in the online environment, the more it builds in a sense of presence. And the fact that there's real flesh and blood human beings here. So, and that's a very simple thing to do. Refer to Lisa or John as you're talking about the ideas that they raised. The other moderating strategy is that I found really useful is to think about consistency and variety. So don't use the same discussion format every single week, right? Students will get really bored with it. Try changing it up, shaping it up based on the learning objectives that you want to meet. And also, but it's also useful to have a rhythm for these. So I used the example before of a Monday, Wednesday, Friday posting schedule, or maybe it's a Monday, Friday posting schedule over 2 weeks. That way students know when they're supposed to be engaging with the course material. If you're sending them broadcast announcements on either Monday or Friday, you can signal these. And after a week or two, they get used to the fact that, that this rhythm has been established and they're more tuned in. Obviously, you want to try to involve all of your students, as many students as you can, and that can be largely done through the way that you construct the discussion board formats themselves. We had a few people asking about the quote analysis earlier and whether you should leave it up to the first 4 students to post or if you should assign students, and you can do either one. In fact, assigning students might be a good way of getting them to, of changing those roles out. Assigning roles in discussions is also another good way of involving all students. And really the bottom line is you're trying to get students to interact with each other, and your job really is to facilitate the conversation, to move it forward rather than to be the person to whom students are communicating, right? The authority. You really want to try to, I think, spread it out. The more you can do that, the more engagement you're going to get from your students. So let's go to the next slide. Paul's going to talk about feedback comments.
Right, and so I was just looking in the chat here, Bill, and if you have any ideas there, that might be useful, especially for Catherine about participation. So yeah, so one of the key things about being in a discussion forum is knowing what it is that you're trying to do there. So having some sort of plan for what you value in the discussion is really critical. So do you want students to sort of take the discussion, have it evolve in a particular way? Are they supposed to add new material? Are they supposed to complicate the question? I mean, are those all good posts? And what may not look like a good post, like something that just says yes, or I agree, or something pretty facile. You might have just a general sense of what it is that you want to encourage, and maybe what it is that maybe you're not discouraging, but you're not really sort of promoting either. So having that sense ahead of time, I think, is really important, and making sure that it aligns with your teaching philosophy. So that's one of the first things. And then having a sense for how you can actually make that move forward. Now, what we know with our comments are that really there are a couple different functions that you want to sort of perform. One is to help students understand what's important in the discussion and in the content, and also to sort of act as not a social engineer, but a social facilitator to help people sort of move back and forth in the discussion and do some of the weaving that maybe students sometimes don't understand they need to do in order to get the most out of the discussion. So we do have a little bit of research on the types of comments that can be helpful. So there was an article that I have right here, actually, from 2019, so this year, by Kwan and 4 colleagues, and it's a small N study. So it's not a huge study, but it's something to go on. And so they sort of divided the types of comments into 3 categories. One was praise-oriented comments, and they found that praise-oriented comments, those that simply agree with someone else or was only encouraging and didn't do anything else, they found that it had no bearing on the outcome of the conversations. Now, they did their study prior to the pandemic, when everybody is living on a sharper knife's edge, maybe we can say. People are a little bit more anxious, they're a little bit more in need of confirmation. So I will not necessarily go out on a limb and say that one shouldn't praise their students for, simply making a discussion go forward. I would actually suggest that it's potentially helpful. So I would go against maybe what the research, at least the incipient research, is telling us in this case. The next 2 types of comments, elaboration encouraging comments, those would be things that would suggest that someone is bringing someone else's posting a boost by extending it in some way. This does have a correlation, and it correlates in 2 ways, as does the third type, perspective widening comments, those kinds of comments that sort of make the conversation broader. We see that we have a greater sense of sort of weaving and connection among students in the forum, so cross postings are increased. And then the forum itself tends to attain saturation or get to a greater number of ideas based on these types of comments. It just sort of builds the conversation in a stronger way. So this is what we know about the types of comments that that instructors and other students can give each other. And the key here is to know what it is you want to encourage. So maybe you don't encourage every single comment in the same way. In fact, you don't have to comment on every single comment. And that's part of what we want to talk about next.
Okay, so we're going to close by talking about assessment. The first thing to consider is whether or not you want to grade these discussion posts at all. There are good reasons not to, particularly if they're low stakes or developmental. They might not need to be graded, just like you might not grade the kind of formative activities that students do in a class when you ask them to write in response to a question or something like that. But you should keep in mind a kind of truism in education, and that is students value what's assessed. They value what's being graded. So if you are expecting or you want students to participate fully, you might consider grading it. If you want to hold students accountable for completing the work, you should probably consider grading it in some format. Or if it's a high stakes activity, like a group forum, for example, or that results in some kind of, some sort of significant work, then it should be assessed. Okay, so I think in terms of low stakes and high stakes activities, low stakes activities in discussion forums don't need to, or some people hold students accountable by saying things like, 10% of your grade is based on participation, and your participation grade will be determined by your the work that you do in the discussion formats. So you might set something out like students have, in order to get an A on that 10% of the course, they have to respond to at least 95% of the posts, and they have to show that they're actually thinking. They have to conform to what you're asking them in the particular post. So participation might be one way of keeping students accountable and assessing them without having to grade every single discussion post. But in other cases, you're going to want to actually go in and mark posts. Okay. One of the ways to do that, first of all, it can be extremely time consuming. If you imagine how many hundreds of posts might be produced over the course of a semester, it would be very difficult to assess every single one of those. It's time consuming. So one of the ways to make it more efficient for you is to consider using a grading rubric. I'm sure you're all familiar with rubrics. We recommend keeping them for these as simple as you can. And for lower stakes activities, it may simply be a 2-point rubric. It's either completed or not completed, or it could be a 3-point rubric where 0 means you didn't do it, or it's completely insufficient. 1 means, yep, you met the criteria. And 2 means that they went above and beyond some way, right? And so that might be a way of being able to very quickly go through a series of posts and mark them. I have a colleague who works at Minneapolis Community and Technical College. She teaches biology, and she says that she can do, she has about 100 of these a week, and she uses a 3-point rubric like I just described, and she said she can go through all of them in under an hour, right? I mean, she's looking for very specific things, just a 0, a 1, 0, 1, 2, 2, and she goes through all students like that. For higher, for more complex work, you may want to use a more formulated rubric that gets at things like the idea generation and the way it's presented, the kinds of things that you might use for a more typical writing assignment. And in those cases, you're going to be spending much more time on each individual contribution. So it might make sense to try to limit the overall number of contributions that you use to assess students. And that's what Paul's going to be talking about now in terms of random grading and having students select their best posts for grading.
Yeah, so Bill was absolutely right that when you start grading posts, if that's your choice, it can be, and you probably maybe have already experienced this or you fear this, and it's a reasonable fear that you're going to be overwhelmed with grading, and if you're not already. So one strategy to sort of reduce this and yet have equal coverage with all students is to do a random selection of posts. And the way that this might work would be, you'd say, okay, I'm going to look at everybody's posts in the first 3 weeks. But you don't look at everybody's post all of week 1 or 2 or 3. What you might do is say, okay, I'm going to divide the class into thirds, and I'm going to grade, and you can do a random sampling. You can get a random number generator. It's pretty easy to find on the web. And you pick a third of the class, and you look at just their posts on week 1, and then a third on week 2, and then on week 3. And that constitutes a module or a unit. And then you rejigger for the next 3 weeks. And you could pick a new random sample, right? So even if someone was sampled in week 3, they may get resampled in week 4, depending on how you want to do it. The key here is to have a method so you can keep track and that you're making sure that you are covering everybody. The one sort of caveat I think that we would add to that is that if you're doing something like that and students don't know when they're going to be graded, you might want to give them a free pass on at least one of those, because you can imagine, you probably experienced this last semester, that some weeks are better than others for people for all kinds of reasons, right? And so you might just say, you know what, your week 7 post is your weakest post, so you can drop that. But I would give them at least one way to sort of say, I wasn't on my game that day, or, hey, why don't you look at my week 8 post, or, some little arbitration that you could allow students to have. Again, if these aren't costing them too much in terms of points, that's going to be less critical. But, it's anytime they're graded, and particularly when there are small points associated with them, they can cause a lot of anxiety. So you want to just be aware of that. But anyway, that's one way of selecting and sampling the class rather than looking at every single post. And it'll help reduce your load by 2/3 or 3/4, depending on how you sort of orient the original selection. The second thing that you can try is having students provide to you their best posts. And the way that this might work would be that you would say at the start of the class, okay, when you are going to be posting to the forum, what I want you to do is first write your post in a Google Doc. Every post that you're going to be writing for this class, you're going to first write in a Google Doc, and then cut and paste, you the student, cut and paste that post into the forum, so that by the end of the class, you'll have a complete record of all your posts, okay? Then at the end of the class, toward the end of the class, maybe the last couple of weeks, you say, okay, I want you to provide me with your top 3 posts, right? Or whatever it is that you want. You set, a number. And then you see what they consider to be their best writing. And when you think about it, this is typically what you would want students to do anyway, or what you'd want to be looking at anyway as their best work, right? What they can potentially achieve. And so it would be, and you could do a combination between, random sampling and their selection as well. But the idea here is be just sort of like a final paper. You wouldn't want them to turn in for their final grade a draft. That might be a portion of their grade, or it might be contributing to the final product, but you're going to probably grade them on that final product, or that'll be the culminating grade at least. So having them select their post has the benefit of reducing the stress on them. They know that they can show themselves in the best light, and students will feel that it's more fair. And it may not be completely representative of their entire body of work, but there are ways to compensate for that, such as if you did a random selection as well, or you just sort of realize, oh, I'm going to do a simple rubric the way that Bill suggested. I'm going to give them 1 or no points based on the length of their posts, and then I'm going to look at the quality of their post based on what they're going to provide us or me with their final selection of posts. So it just means having them retain all of their posts or compose all their posts initially in a Google Doc. It's a change of their workflow, and it only is a change in yours insofar as that you're going to be sort of back-ending a lot of your grading toward the end of the semester. Well, Bill, is that where we are at this point? Are we at the final point?
Yep, I think that's the conclusion.
Okay, so so now we're sort of ready to take questions, and I'm sure there might have been some questions in the chat as well that we might not have attended to.
Right.
But feel free to open your mic and or if you've got comments or ideas, we'd love to hear them.
Or if you need to leave, thank you for participating too. And just to remind you that if you want to talk more about your own particular context, you can also contact cei@umn.edu and request a consultation. In fact, I'll put that in the chat for you.
Just did it, there we go.
Okay, thanks. So are there any questions?
Or anybody have some great ideas?
Yeah, exactly.
Hello, Paul. It's Cindy Pete McAlpin. I'm from the School of Nursing, and I'm a member of the Academy of Distinguished Teachers. And, you know, my reason for attending today is to kind of think about discussion posts. We have revised our PhD program. And so what we're doing, it's kind of going to become a program where we have some face-to-face and some online. So I guess you'd call it a hybrid. I don't want to call it a hybrid. I want to kind of think about it more as, oh God, it's hard for me to describe right now, but so let's not go there. But I think my biggest question is, you know, we talked today about different things. And what I took away was that for our students, we would be most focused as faculty on elaborating, I think, on if you give people some information, elaborating on helping them to extend their ideas about what they've read. And so, I don't know, and what you're thinking about that, or in relation to that kind of different ways of thinking, and, you know, Bloom's taxonomy revised, where that idea of creation becomes, you know, the highest level of learning. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts today, but my thought is I want to bring you in, all of you, into our School of Nursing, so that, and into our PhD Council, so that we might be able to start thinking about ways of thinking about very higher levels of learning for our students, if we're going to begin to put things online. And that's not to say, oh my God, I mean, there are so many things that you've talked about that have been so wonderful, because I've been an undergrad, I've taught undergrads for many, many years, and master's students for a lot of years. And then now I'm at the PhD level, but and I'm kind of thinking, you know, we can like raise the bar a whole lot higher. So I wonder what your thoughts are.
Bill, do you have any comments? So you've worked with nursing before.
Yeah, you know what, Paul, I was actually responding to some people in the chat and pulling up some information that I was going to share here. So I thought that was directed to you.
Okay, no, it was to you. No, so I think the idea was, how do you get students to begin to elaborate on their comments and achieve a higher level, especially when you're thinking of Bloom's taxonomy, so that they are engaging each other. And I would say that one of the things is to begin to model that. And as a facilitator, you can do that by returning serve to the poster, so that if they say something that is provocative, you point that out. Or maybe you see like 6 or 7 posts to begin with. Maybe you do a synthesis post and say, okay, you're talking about this, you're talking about this. Who's got ideas that can take us a little bit further? So it's one of those things that as the facilitator, you can begin to show them, again, what it is that you value there, simply by prompting them with a new question, or saying, hey, you know, this, what you said right here is really interesting. Does anybody have any examples of this? Or where, does anybody take issue with this solution? What are the problems with something like this? It works in this situation, but would it work here? So part of that is, it's just in the facilitation of those original posts.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it could have to do with the prompting too. So one of the things I was digging up while you were asking the question was in response to, and I'm going to share my screen again, to a question about rubrics and discussion prompts. Whoops. So this is something that, can you all see this?
No, not yet, Bill.
Oh, sorry. How is that? Is it better? Can
Yeah,
you
we got it. Yep.
Okay. So this is pulled from an article quite a while ago that deals with this particular topic. And here's a rubric that that John Bauer has created that I think would work across different discussion types. It's for higher stakes writing, because that was one of the questions. If you're switching up your discussion weekly or bi-weekly, is that disadvantage students? In other words, they feel like it's going to be unfair to grade them when things are changing? And I confess I hadn't heard that question before, but I could see some students maybe feeling that. So this might be having a generalized rubric where you're saying, okay, what are the skills that a really excellent post hits? What are the skills that an adequate post hits? And what are the things that an inadequate post is missing, right? And those might go across different kinds of discussions. So it might be the way that you analyze the particular issue, the way that you engage your students, the way that you, the coherence with which you write, those might be the criteria that you use. Then you construct a rubric around those types of things, right? Maybe time, did you do it on time? Are you making an effort to involve other students? Those might be other criteria that you could build into a rubric. In terms of prompts, this is something we get a lot too. And here's some examples of different kinds of prompts that we just put together. So I think the first two are generally don't work very well. In this one, so this is for a literature course, but you can read that for yourself. It's pretty vague, right? Share your thoughts on one of these poems, post your response by the end of the week. So you don't tell them when it's due or by what time. You don't really tell them what to post other than their thoughts. Does that mean that I like it? Or does that mean you want me to explicate it, right? You need to be more specific. But you see a lot of posts like this, right? They're easy to write, but they're not terribly effective. Here's, I think, a better one. And I'm not going to read it all for you, but what it does is it sets out the context of the issue that you want to investigate. It very clearly lists how long it should be, and what students should be doing, as well as when it's due, right? And then there's also a nod to some of the ways that the way that it will be assessed. So I think this one is more of the kind. This is more of the type of prompt that I'm thinking about in terms of being specific.
See, Bill, there was a question in the chat from Catherine wondering if that's possible to get a copy of the grading rubric. Can you put that in the chat, or is there another way to?
Yeah, this is a Word doc. Yes, I will. You know what? I wonder if we can. Do you know? Can I attach something to the chat?
Yeah, there's a file. I think you can just put it in there.
Okay, let me.
So.
Well, if you can just like send it to all the participants, I think that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I think we can.
And I thank you for this. I think this is very helpful, but I still want to move it to a higher level. So I think, we would love to invite you over to the School of Nursing, and I will certainly do that. I'm very worried about moving our program from a completely face-to-face, delivery system into to a hybrid program. And I'm just worried about how does that dialogue happen at such a high level, which I expect from my students, but throughout, I guess that, I have to confess, I'm an older professor. And so, but I've tried, and I have taught online a few courses in our Doctor of Nursing Practice program, but our PhD program is very different. And I'm very worried about how that might be happening or compromised. I hate to say compromise, that's a very negative term. I should probably say how we could optimize that more in an online way of thinking. My thing has always been that our students, at least my experience over DNP students has been, gee, okay, so here's the question, right? And let me think about this for 3 days, right? Formulate my answer and post it. And then there's no dialogue. And
Yeah.
try and get that dialogue going is such a problem. And so I feel like, wow, I could be seen as like this, I don't know what to say, the wicked witch, trying to make them, or not make them, but trying to encourage them to be more thoughtful and responsive to their peers.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you guys think about that, but I'm sure you've thought
Yeah.
that through and you have some solutions. So
I think, one of the first things again is just planning out the discussion. So it could be if you want to create that interaction, maybe because they're at a higher level, maybe you have smaller groups. So instead of having a whole class of 20 discussing the same thing, which can become chaotic, maybe you have groups of 6 or 5. And then you might say, here's the first prompt, and then I want you to post again to appear following these guidelines by Wednesday, or whatever your timing sequence is. So I think I wouldn't worry about being overly directive, even though they're high level students. I think in this kind of environment, it's unfamiliar enough to people that the more guidance you provide, I think the better. The other thing to think about is, when we have had conversations with Chris Miller about ways to support the DNP program when it goes to this high flex model that you were talking about. One of the ways of thinking about this, and this is kind of beyond the context of this seminar, but is to think about the ways in which you sort of marry the asynchronous discussions with what happens synchronously.
Yes.
So if you have face-to-face meetings, maybe they set out their initial thinking in a post, and then the dialogue or the interaction happens in a web or in a Zoom breakout room or something. So you can do it asynchronously. It takes a little bit longer, and it may feel a little less dynamic to some students. So that's the other thing. Make use of if you have synchronous meetings, that might be a really nice way of doing it. Think about like a 2-tiered approach. The first part is the discussion, right, where they post something. And then the second part is maybe using what they thought about and wrote about as a spur to a face-to-face discussion with a smaller group of peers.
I think that sounds brilliant. I wish that I could say that has been talked to the faculty about, and we have heard nothing about that. So my thought is that I would, as chair of the curriculum committee, I would really like to think about an invitation for you all to come over and talk about these things. And I hope that you are willing to do that. And I'm going to not say anything and let everybody else chime in now. Thanks so much, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay.
Catherine was asking, is there a trade-off between speed and quality of comments? Some students are both fast and thoughtful, but others seem to need more time or not say very much.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's a good point. One of the values of, I think, asynchronous forums is that you can devote more time to them. In fact, there has been some research I remember looking at quite a while ago that asynchronous forums actually are very equitable because they give equal time to students who are shyer, who might not like to speak in front of a group of people, or who need more time formulating their thoughts, or international students, right, for whom English isn't a second language. It provides an opportunity for them to actually contribute to the discussion, whereas they might not have the same kind of opportunity in real time. So normally, I don't really think of speed being an issue for online asynchronous discussions, typically because, at least the way I've always done them, they usually have at least a couple days before they're required to repost to somebody, which seems to me enough time for them to really dig into it.
And I would add there, Bill, that your comment, if you could just scroll up that grading rubric again,
Yeah.
the example posts.
You mean right here?
Yeah, exactly. I think, or these are the discussion posts. We don't have any example posts, do we? We
No,
used to
we
have
don't.
something.
No. Uh-huh.
Yeah, we used to, when we were thinking about this workshop, we had some posts from students. And one way to address this might be to show them like this is sort of what is a so-so post. This is what is a sort of okay post, a valid post. And here's something that is an exceptional post. Give them a sense of what it is that you're experiencing. In fact, it's a great thing to do in a peer discussion. Have them come to consensus on what constitutes the strong post versus a satisfactory post or a poor post.
Yeah.
And having that, even though it takes a little bit of time at the opening, it can help you sort of determine a new norm for how you're going to be grading it. And again, you're just down to a 3-point rubric at that stage.
That's right. Yeah. And that reminds me of what Sarah said a little bit earlier in the chat as well. She said one thing to do is that's worked for her is giving examples of the types of responses that deepen learning. So things that she's used are disagreeing with someone while identifying common ground, disagreeing and offering an alternative perspective, agreeing and then adding another reason or evidence in support of the point, and asking a probing or clarifying question. So that would be, first of all, that would be a perfect thing to provide to students as part of the prompt that you're giving them, right? As you reply to students, think of one of these four, what do you want to call them, approaches, right? And respond to the student using this, right? To respond to your peer using one of these things. I think that's a great idea. It provides structure, but there's enough choice and flexibility to interest students. And I think you would have a really rich and high level discussion. Yeah, so thank you for that, Sarah.
Yeah.
What else? Okay. Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we are at 2 o'clock. We're certainly happy to stay here to chat with you if you'd like. Otherwise, we will bid you adieu and enjoy this beautiful day we have. Hopefully you'll be able to get outside a little bit.